Saram students, welcome back. Today let us continue with history. Lesson number 10, New Empires and Kingdoms. Children, in a previous class we had learnt about the Pallavas, Chalukyas and the Pulakeshins Prashasti. That is, the Pallavas and the Chalukyas, they were important ruling dynasties in South India. And Pulakeshin too, he was the famous Chalukya ruler. His court poet Ravi Kirti, he composed poems in his praise, and it was Pulakeshin too who checked the advance of Harshavardhana. And we had also learnt about how were these kingdoms administered. That is, the land revenue, it remained important for the rulers, and the village, it remained the basic unit of administration. And we learnt about the different administrative posts. And children, today we shall learn about a new kind of army and assemblies in the southern kingdoms, and about ordinary people in the kingdoms and elsewhere, that is about Arabia. Now children, let us learn about a new kind of army. Like earlier rulers, some of these kings, they maintained a well organized army with elephants, chariots, cavalry and foot soldiers. Besides, there were military leaders who provided the king with troops whenever he needed them. But they were not paid regular salaries. Instead, some of them, they received grants of land. So children, some of these kings, like earlier rulers, they maintained a well organized army. That is, they had elephants, chariots and also cavalry and foot soldiers, and they also had military leaders. And what did these military leaders do? They provided the king with troops whenever the king needed them. But were they given salaries? No, they were not given regular salaries. So instead of this, some of them, they received grants of land. And these military leaders, they collected revenue from the land, and they used this to maintain the soldiers and the horses, and they also provided equipment for warfare. And these men, they were known as Samantas. And whenever the ruler was weak, these Samantas, they tried to become independent. So children, what did the military leaders collect? They collected revenue from the land. And how did they use it? They used it to maintain the soldiers and the horses, and they also provided equipment for warfare to the kings. And what are these men known as? These men, they were known as Samantas. And what did Samantas do whenever the ruler was weak? These Samantas, they tried to become independent when the ruler was weak. Now children, let us learn about the assemblies in the southern kingdoms. The inscriptions of the Pallavas, they mention a number of local assemblies. These included the Sabha, which was an assembly of Brahmin land owners, and this assembly, it functioned through subcommittees which looked after irrigation, agricultural operations and for making roads, local temples, etc. So children, what do the inscriptions of the Pallavas mention? They mention a number of local assemblies. And what did these include? These included the Sabha. What do you mean by Sabha? It was an assembly of Brahmin land owners. And how did this assembly function? This assembly, it functioned through subcommittees which looked after irrigation, agricultural operations, making roads, local temples, etc. And children, the Ur, it was a village assembly, and it was found in areas where the landowners, they were not Brahmins. And the Nagaram, it was an organization of merchants. It is likely that these assemblies were controlled by rich and powerful landowners and merchants. And many of these local assemblies, they continued to function for centuries. So children, what was a village assembly? The Ur, it was a village assembly. And where was it found? it was found in the areas where the landowners, they were not the Brahmins. And what do you mean by Nagaram? The Nagaram, it was an organization of merchants. And how were these assemblies controlled? These assemblies, they were controlled by rich and powerful landowners and merchants. And these local assemblies, they continued to function for centuries, that is for many years. Now children, let us learn about ordinary people in the kingdoms. We can catch an occasional glimpse of the lives of ordinary people from plays and other accounts. And Kalidasa, he is known for his plays depicting life in the king's court. And an interesting feature about these plays is that the king and most Brahmins, they are shown as speaking Sanskrit, while women and men other than the king and Brahmins, they use Prakrit. So children, how can we know about the ordinary people in the kingdoms? We can get an occasional glimpse of the lives of the ordinary people from plays and other accounts. And who is known for his plays? Kalidasa, he is known for his plays. And what does this plays depict? His plays depict life in the king's court. And what is an interesting feature about these plays? An interesting feature about these plays is that the king and most Brahmins, they are shown as speaking Sanskrit, while women and men other than the king and the Brahmins, they use Prakrit. That means the kings and the Brahmins, they speak in Sanskrit, and the women and the men, they use Prakrit language. And Kalidasa's most famous play, Abhignana Shakuntalam, it is the story of the love between a king named Dushyanta and a young woman named Shakuntala. So, what is Abhignana Shakuntalam? It is the most famous play, and it is the story of the love between a king named Dushyanta and a young woman named Shakuntala. Now children, here we find an interesting description of the plight of a poor fisherman in this play. A fisherman finds a ring. A fisherman, he found a precious ring which the king had given to Shakuntala, but which had been accidentally swallowed by a fish. When he went to the palace with it, the gateman accused him of theft, and the chief police officer was rather rude. However, the king was happy when he saw the ring and sent a reward for the fisherman. Then the police officer and the gateman, they decided to take a share of the reward and went along with the fisherman to have a drink. So children, who found a precious ring? A fisherman, he found a precious ring. And who had given it to Shakuntala? King Dushyanta had given it to Shakuntala. And who accidentally swallowed the ring? It was accidentally swallowed by a fish. And where did the fisherman go with it? He went to the palace with the ring. And who accused him of theft? The gateman, he accused him of theft. And who was rude with him? The chief police officer, he was rather rude with the fisherman. And why was the king happy? The king was happy when he saw the ring, and what did he do? He sent a reward for the fisherman. Then what did the police officer and the gateman decide? They decided to take a share of the reward, and they went along with the fisherman to have a drink. And the Chinese pilgrim Pazian, he noticed the plight of those who were treated as untouchables by the high and mighty. And these untouchables, they were expected to live on the outskirts of the city. And he writes that if such a man, he enters a town or a marketplace, then he has to strike a piece of wood in order to keep himself separate. And the people, on hearing this sound, they know what it means, and they avoid touching him or brushing against him. Who was Fazian? He was the Chinese pilgrim. And what had he noticed? He had noticed the plight of those who were treated as untouchables by the high and mighty, that is by the powerful people. And where were they expected to live? They were expected to live on the outskirts of the city, that is on the outer parts of the city. And what has he written about the untouchables? He has written that if the untouchable he enters a town or a marketplace, then what he has to do? He has to strike a piece of wood. Why? In order to keep himself separate. And then what will the people do? The people, on hearing this sound, they come to know what it means, and so they avoid touching him or brushing against him. And children, Banabhatta, he provides us with a vivid picture of the king's army on the move. Now let us see about the king's army. The king, he travelled with an enormous amount of equipment. Apart from weapons, there were things of daily use, such as pots, pans, furniture, golden footstools, food, including animals such as goat, deer, rabbits, vegetables, spices, and they carried on carts or loaded on to pack animals such as camels and elephants. And this huge army, it was accompanied by musicians beating drums and others playing horns and trumpets. And villagers, they had to provide hospitality along the way. They came with gifts of curds, gourd and flowers, and provided fodder for the animals. And they also tried to meet the king and place their complaints and petitions before him. And the army, it left a trail of destruction behind. Elephants, they often trampled down the huts of villagers, and the oxen, yoked to the caravans of merchants, ran away, scared by the tumult. And as Banabhatta says, the whole world was swallowed up in dust. So children, how did the king travel? The king travelled with an enormous amount of equipment. And what all things did he carry along with him? Apart from weapons, there were things of daily use, such as pots, pans, furniture, golden footstools, food, including animals such as goat, deer and rabbits, and vegetables, spices. These all they were carried on the carts, or they were loaded onto the pack animals such as camels and elephants. Who accompanied this huge army? This huge army was accompanied by musicians beating drums and others playing horns and trumpets. What did the villagers do? They had to provide hospitality along the way. Hospitality means the friendly and generous reception. And what did the villagers come with? They came with gifts of curds, gourd and flowers. And they also provided fodder for the animals. And they also tried to meet the king. And they placed their complaints and petitions before him. And what did the army leave behind? The army left a trail of destruction behind. That is, the elephants, they often trampled down the huts of villagers. And the oxen that were yoked to the caravans of the merchants, they ran away. Why? Because they were scared by the tumult, that is, by the uproar or loud noise. And Banabhatta, he says that the whole world, it was swallowed up in dust. So children, make a list of all the things that were carried with the army. And what did the villagers bring for the king? Children, you can write it down in your notebooks. Now children, let us learn elsewhere, that is about Arabia. Children, find Arabia on map 6. We can see that Arabia, although it is a desert, it was at the hub of communications for centuries. And in fact, the Arab merchants and sailors. They played an important role in the sea trade between India and Europe. Children, here you can see in the map. So, who played an important role in the sea trade? Arab merchants and sailors. They played an important role in the sea trade. And the sea trade was between which countries? It was between India and Europe. And others who lived in Arabia, they were the Bedouins, that is the pastoral tribes, depending mainly on camels, hardy animals that could survive in the desert. So children, who others lived in Arabia? Bedouins, that is the pastoral tribes, they lived in Arabia. And on what did they depend? They depended mainly on camels and hardy animals that could survive in the desert. And around 1400 years ago, Prophet Muhammad, he introduced a new religion, Islam, in Arabia. And like Christianity, Islam was a religion that laid stress on the equality and unity of all before Allah, the one supreme God. And here is a verse from the Quran, the sacred book of Islam, that is for Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for true men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in Allah's remembrance. For them has Allah prepared forgiveness and great reward. And within 100 years, Islam it spread to North Africa, Spain, Iran and India. And Arab sailors who were already familiar with the coastal settlements of the subcontinent, they now brought the new religion with them. And Arab soldiers, they conquered Sindh, that is in present day Pakistan, about 1300 years ago. So children, who introduced a new religion Islam in Arabia? Prophet Muhammad, he introduced a new religion Islam in Arabia. How many years ago? Around 1400 years ago. And what did this religion laid stress on? Like Christianity, Islam, it also laid stress on the equality and unity of all before Allah, the one supreme God. And which is the sacred book of Islam? Quran is the sacred book of Islam. And children, here you can see the verse from the Quran, that is for Muslim men and women who believe, devout and who are true and who are patient and constant and who humble themselves and who give in charity, who fast, who guard their chastity and who engage much in Allah's remembrance. For them Allah has prepared forgiveness and great reward. And within 100 years, where did Islam spread? It spread to North Africa, Spain, Iran and India. And how many years ago did Arab soldiers conquer Sindh? Arab soldiers, they conquered Sindh, that is in present day Pakistan, about 1300 years ago. Now children, let us recap what we have learned today in this lesson. Today we learnt about a new kind of army, that is some of these kings, they maintained a well organized army with elephants, chariots, cavalry and foot soldiers. Also there were military leaders who provided the king with troops whenever he needed them. They collected revenue from the land and used this to maintain soldiers and horses and provided equipment for warfare. These men were known as Samantas, and whenever the ruler was weak, Samantas, they tried to become independent. Then we learnt about assemblies in the southern kingdoms, that is the inscriptions of the Pallavas mention a number of local assemblies. These included the Sabha, which was an assembly of Brahmin landowners, functioned through subcommittees which looked after irrigation, agricultural operations, making roads, local temples, etc. And the Ur, it was a village assembly in the areas where the landowners were not Brahmins. And the assemblies, they were controlled by powerful merchants and landowners. And we learnt about ordinary people in the kingdoms, that is the lives of the ordinary people. It can be taken from plays and other accounts. And the plays of Kalidasa depicted life in the king's court. The kings and Brahmins were shown speaking Sanskrit, while ordinary men and women spoke Prakrit in these plays. And his most famous play was Abhignana Shakuntalam, and it mentions about Dushyanta, Shakuntala, and also an interesting description of the plight of a poor fisherman in this play. And the Chinese pilgrim Faxian noticed the practice of untouchability by the high and powerful people, and Banabhatta, he provided an account of the marches of the large armies of the king. And we also learnt elsewhere, that is about Arabia. Arabia, although it is a desert, it was at the hub of communications for centuries. And around 1400 years ago, Prophet Muhammad introduced a new religion, Islam, in Arabia. Like Christianity, Islam was a religion that laid stress on the equality and unity of all before Allah, the one supreme God. And within 100 years, Islam spread to North Africa, Spain, Iran, and India. And the Arab sailors, who were already familiar with the coastal settlements of the subcontinent, now brought the new religion with them. And the Arab soldiers, they conquered Sindh, that is in present-day Pakistan, about 1300 years ago. Now children, let's have a quiz. Multiple choice questions. First one, who tried to become independent when rulers became weak? A. Harshavardhana, B. Samantas, C. Chandragupta. What's the correct answer? Correct. B. Samantas. Samantas tried to become independent when rulers became weak. Second one, Dash was an assembly of Brahmin land owners. A. Samiti, B. Sabha, C. None of these. What's the correct answer? Correct. B. Sabha. Sabha was an assembly of Brahmin land owners. Third one, who was famous for his plays depicting life in the king's court? A. Banabhatta, B. Ravikirti, C. Kalidasa. What's the correct answer? Correct. C. Kalidasa. Kalidasa was famous for his plays depicting life in the king's court. So today we have completed history lesson number 10, New Empires and Kingdoms. So children, read this lesson thoroughly. Till we meet again, goodbye children.